So, welcome to Module 5, and we continue our exploration of assessment and the different components that we make up our assessments. And so, we talked about interviews in Module 4. In Module 5, now we're going to look at observation procedures and looking at different types of observation that can illustrate a little bit more on an individual's difficulties. Now, this is probably going to be easier in younger children, especially in the school settings, which is something that I do, because you kind of have a captive audience, but you can certainly do them in other places. So, one of the types of observations that we're going to discuss is informal ones. These are primarily qualitative. In other words, it's just writing out literally what is happening in that environment. And so the clinician observes the person's behavior and the environment in which it occurs in, and they don't try to attempt to do things like recording frequency or intensity of specific behaviors, because that's going to be for a much more formalized kind of process. But the good thing is you get to see the person in their natural environment. Now, you can also do them in more controlled settings. So you may have some informal observations and people, say, in inpatient settings, and you're doing observations there, which is obviously not their natural setting. Schools are going to be probably the easiest and more with child and adolescents. A little harder to do those type of informal observations with adults, though you certainly could. A lot of clinicians don't necessarily do this outside of more institutional type settings like schools or inpatient, because it is very time intensive. You have to get to the location, you've got to observe, and of course you got to observe without the person changing their behavior. Now, in a more modern age, you may have cameras, which you can do something like that too. But then there's the issues of privacy and confidentiality of the client to consider at that point. So, informal observations just give us a good idea of what these things are looking like. Because I can tell you, if I bring in a child into my clinic, that a lot of times one-on-one, they're great. I don't see any problems at all. But the moment you see them in a school setting, you're like, oh, okay, now I see the distractibility. Now I see some of the oppositional behavior and whatever it might be. So that's informal observations. Now, another type are use of rating scales, behavior rating scales, and it's going to ask an observer to make judgments and rate behaviors on a scale. And it helps provide an abstract description of the person's behavior. So what I've listed there is 3 different very common behavior rating scales that are used a lot in childhood. The one on the left is called the ACEBA scales. The one on the middle is called the Basque, and the one on the right are the Connors. All of them are behavior rating scales, and they basically are kind of putting you on a dimension of a variety of characteristics of things like inattention, hyperactivity, oppositional conduct issues, anxiety, depression, somatization, all of these sorts of areas. And what it allows you to do then is kind of have that good description of a person from that individual observer's perspective. So typically when I'm doing evaluations, I'm going to give a couple of these to the parents who are involved in the caretaking at home, and then a couple to teachers who have that child in class. So then I get a school and home kind of setting, and then I also have 4 different people's perceptions of the issues, so that no one person's biases come to the forefront and possibly color what we would ultimately diagnose. So those are behavior rating scales. Any of you who eventually go work in the schools or work with children and adolescents are going to probably see these rating scales at some point in your career. Here's an assessment procedure for doing more formalized kind of observations, and this is where you incorporate a behavioral coding system. And you're focusing in this case on frequency of very specific or targeted behavioral kind of events. A lot of times on-task behavior is a very common one. And so you go and you watch at particular intervals. So 5 seconds on, 5 seconds off. And in those 5 seconds, if you observe a certain behavior, you give a little tick mark. If you don't, you leave it blank. And then in the end, you calculate percentage of on-task time or any other behavior that you might be trying to register. Now, this is a much more formalized kind of process. You can use it for observations in the person's natural environment as well as a more artificial kind of contrived kind of situation. One may be where you're trying to elicit the behavior, get a better understanding of it. You can include self-monitoring where the client's going to observe and record their own behavior. However, that's going to bring in the client's own biases, and especially for on-task behavior. I mean, you just said they can't pay attention, right? And so how are they going to pay attention to monitoring themselves in any sort of level of accuracy? So you can use these behavioral coding systems in a variety of ways. In school psychology, we're using these a lot for initial diagnosis of behavioral issues, but we also use it to monitor our interventions, our behavioral interventions. So if we're targeting on-task behavior, want to improve the amount of time that child or adolescent's on task, then we go ahead and may do this sporadically to kind of help measure our progress and see if that's really working, or do we need to switch things up? So that's a more formalized kind of observation in behavioral coding systems. Some other things that we may be looking for as part of the observations is what they call the ABCs, which is antecedent behavior and consequences. So we may be using our observations to try to observe what happens before the behavior. In other words, what kind of triggers it. Then what is the actual behavior? Maybe look at that. Or what are the consequences of that behavior? In other words, why is that behavior being done? Is there something reinforcing that behavior to occur more frequently than it would otherwise? And so behavior observations are really good, especially in the natural setting, and being able to figure out the ABCs. And once you figure that out, you can modify, say, the triggers so that if the triggers don't happen, then the behaviors probably don't happen. Or the fact that all the kids giggle and look at the child after a certain behavior, which is very reinforcing, you teach the other children to ignore the behavior and therefore takes away that reinforcement. There's a lot of ways you can look at that. Okay, so what are the advantages and disadvantages in case of observations? Well, the advantage is it really does supplement interview information. So not only do you get the perspective of the individual that you've interviewed, but now I'm actually looking at the behavior and are there things they're leaving out, or did they minimize, or just miss in its entirety. It is the most direct source of information because you're actually looking at the individual in the moment that they're in. And it doesn't rely just on self-report because, once again, we have our own biases. And so it's a more objective way of looking at the behaviors that might be happening. Now, that being said, you can't observe forever, right? So most of the time, 20, 30-minute observations, maybe an hour at most, and only a couple of them. So you may not capture some of those behaviors. That's why we still need the interviews and self-reports in that way. So as you can see, limitations could be time consuming and expensive. Individuals sitting here, if I'm charging my typical rate, it's not cheap to have me sitting there observing, or even somebody who may be an aide to me. There can still be bias. So, I may have especially more informal kind of observation, my own little biases that kind of come through. The fact that you're being observed oftentimes will alter the behavior. So I always like to say, if I could only bottle what I usually have in about the first 5 minutes I'm around a child and their behavior, I would be a millionaire, because me sitting in there, somebody new, somebody kind of exotic in the normal situations, means that they are like, oh, okay, this newness, now I'm going to behave like I need to behave. And then usually a few minutes in, you begin to see all of them. But some kids, it happens for the entire time. I'll go talk to the teacher afterwards. It's like, well, I didn't really see much. And they're like, yeah, they never behave that well. And that would be an example of one of these limitations. And the observations, they don't really generalize necessarily to all situations. So you got to be careful on when you do your observation. For example, if a child has a reading problem, you go observe them in math, you don't see any issues. That's because maybe the reading is one of the reasons it's causing some of the behavioral issues. And so we don't want to have that come through. Okay. So these are just once again, some other tools that we have. And in our module 6, we're going to go through the last of those sets of tools, which are personality tests like the Rorschach ink blot. and self-report inventories. So stay tuned for our last module going over classification and assessment.